How indoctrinated are the European elites? How much do they believe in their own propaganda? Why is it that understanding Russia or China or any other of these nations, quote, opponent or possible partner is verboten? Why is it considering that if you understand some other nation like that, you are now in their service? What is the insanity that has gripped the Western elites? Find out more as I discuss this and other issues with Glenn Diesen. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of India Has the Truth. We've got back with us Professor Glenn Diesen. Yes, he hasn't migrated to Russia yet. He's still in Norway. But we're working on it. By the way, Glenn, interesting thing that I noticed when I was doing my first episode in the history of Russia was that the R1A haplogroup, which is the Slavic, and by the way, the Indians are also R1A, so kind of split went two directions, versus the Germans and the Scandinavians, which are R1B haplogroup, the next wave in. In southern Norway, there's a huge amount of R1As. They're up to 50% of the population. I mean, that was what the genetics charts were showing. Uh, any idea how so many Slavs wound up in southern Norway?
No, I have no good. Well, we had, under Kivenros. Well, I don't think that's where it would come from, but under Kivenros, we did have, they did have close connections with the Vikings from the north, as well, the Byzantine from the south, and but I'm not. To be honest, I did know that earlier as well. I found out after talking with you earlier, but I didn't know. I thought that was. Unexpected because there's no other concentration like this in at least Western Europe. So I thought it
Right.
was
Well, yeah, the Eastern Germany used to be all actually Slavic. It was Sorbs, it was Vens. Actually, Vens used to go Viking all the time, and everybody else.
yeah.
But they weren't too organized, so they got taken out one town at a time. But yeah, it was just very interesting that southern Norway has this really heavy concentration. I mean, it was marked out 50% plus, I think, was on the chart. Now, those are the final color.
Yeah, but from what I understand, most of this migration would have occurred in the prehistoric times, so before we had yeah written it down. So it's there's a lot of theories I assume, and yeah, but nothing solid from what I understand though.
Yeah, maybe Norwegians are really Slavs. That would blow some people's minds.
Yeah, no, especially these days with this rampant Russophobia, they would shake people's heads, I guess.
We'll start the Pan-Slavic Congress. We'll have to invite Norway. One of the Slavic lands, sitting right between Bulgaria and maybe Belarus.
Yeah, it would be an interesting identity shift. Like in this part, countries often they choose their identities based on what is comfortable. So, a few years ago, the Baltic states, for example, began to many of them identify themselves as Scandinavian, which I thought was interesting. Uh, but it's also, what is West? In the past, the Germany wasn't West; it was
Right.
part of the East. The West would be Britain, France, the competing maritime powers, of course, the Americans, but the Germans as this land power in the East, the barbarians, they belonged to the East. So all of these identities they shift, and then you have the Hungarians. They insist they're not Eastern, they're Central. This I don't know. It's it gets confusing after a while. So I wouldn't expect the Norwegians to join the Slavic conferences right away, but I'll definitely participate. So that's fine.
Yeah, it's well a lot of the maps they tend to drop 42% of Europe off the map because that's all Russian. So they may take Belarus on there, but they won't take Russia. But that's the official geographical lines end at the Ural Mountains and the Northern Caucasus.
Yeah. Well, the way language is used is often interesting in politics, so because after the Cold War, you had the EU being established, taking over from the European community, and they began to gradually kind of monopolize on the term of Europe. That is, they first called themselves European Union, and then they just started dropping off the Union a bit, and then they started to talk about Europe, and suddenly gradually they moved towards Russia becoming a non-European country. And it is, yeah, this large, it's a bit strange to have the largest country in Europe become a non-European country. But yeah, the way we use language, it is interesting to manipulate geography. But yeah, reality somehow comes back at the end.
But then again, you've got Eurovision, which also has what Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Israel. Where absolutely in any
Yeah.
book are Asian nations at that point. But
But also the Europeans, but it was a bigger thing. I remember back in when the neighborhood policy of the EU came out in 2004, they began to shift the language as well because as the EU and NATO expanded, they said, "Oh, we're moving closer there," and but then it sounds like the EU is expanding, and this could seem offensive to some. So they began to change the language. So as the neighborhood pulls closer to Europe, which means it's a bit like I forgot who he was the American spokesperson at the White House who is making the point that Russia is getting closer to NATO's borders. It's like, how did that happen? And no, it's yeah, the language is interesting. I mean, the British they used to do a lot of interesting academic work on this in the 90s because a bit in the early 2000s because they were always a bit critical of the EU. So they came up with concepts like Eurospeak, how you should so, so if you want to centralize powers in Brussels, you say more Europe. So you have this. Yeah, it's interesting how yeah, the language is used. I saw a comment. Oh, well, now I forgot who said it. It was a commentary. I think it was a Ukrainian general. Something he was making the point. Oh, wait, no, I don't think it was Solution. I forgot who it was. Was making the point that the Europeans they have their own their own language. They don't want to say things the way they actually are. And again, this is, I think, very correct. This obsession with social construction that is will make up our own words for what things should mean. It can be confusing to outsiders, I think.
oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's well, it kind of fits into the this reality of Ukraine has turned the tide and all these other things that gets pumped out that has nothing to do with actual reality on the ground. Speaking of reality on the ground, so
Well,
the
also we're not aggressive. We are assertive. You people, you have wars. We have interventions.
yeah, yes, yes.
It is. Yeah. So there's a whole vocabulary you have to use. The whole point is always you shouldn't be able to compare. That is, everything is black or white. It's yeah, your own language for what we do, and then the different language for what the other side does. And it's yeah, it's as yeah, Orwell wrote extensively on. It's when you don't make arguments anymore. Instead, you just manipulate the language. Then
Hmm.
yeah, the language is becoming very political, which is unfortunate. Yeah.
Well, you remember what the British said when they were with Iran when it was all starting. They're gonna do aggressive defense. We're not bombing them. We're just conducting aggressive defense.
Yeah. Again, that's Eurospeak as well, though. That's how. Yeah, that's a very good example. Also, Pakistan under Khan, he was accused. What did the Americans accused him of doing? uh, Aggressive diplomacy or something because he maintained diplomatic ties with Moscow.
Hmm.
I think it was yeah I think it was aggressive diplomacy or something around yeah um, yeah. Anyways, this is yeah, this is how language is changing.
Um, yeah, yeah. You pretty much just have to take the opposite of what's being said. That's the reality. What was Orwell's Newspeak? So this is Eurospeak.
Yeah, but it's
Yeah,
built on the same ideas though.
yeah, yep. Um, Well, speaking of Newspeak and Eurospeak, and everything's great and hunky dory. Um, the news is coming out that the gas reserves are under 50% for most of the European countries. Coming that summer is when they normally fill up the gas reserves for the winter. And I think they're supposed to be at 80% about right now.
Hello, dear friends. Just want to remind you if you like this video or you like what you hear, click like, subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Send it to your friends. Let's grow this channel. Maybe we can finally hit it up to 100,000. That'd be a good round number for the summer. So let me know, leave some comments, and give a thumbs up. So look forward to seeing you in the next video. Cheers.
How's that being taken, or is that just not even being noticed?
Yeah, well, no, it is being noticed. Is causing a bit of a, it will cause big problems, especially in the months ahead. But there's surprisingly little being done. And again, I don't have any good answers for this. It's a bit of a mystery, but it fits within a wider category of European leaders no longer discussing to a large extent national interests. They speak in the language of values. They stand for this, they oppose this, but yeah, the basic national interest is not really discussed to a great extent. And I find it, yeah, of course, strange. I mean, since you can't build a civilization without energy, and
Yeah.
I think they ignored to a large extent the importance of the especially connection with Russia in terms of the European economic model. That is, yeah, the Russians provided cheap, reliable energy, and also for the finished goods, Russia was a big market to export to. But this relationship was to a large extent also premised on the assumption by Russia that if they integrated their economy more towards the West, that is to give some privileged role for the Europeans and the West in general for Russian energy markets, that this was a means to an end, that you would have some kind of a greater Europe down the line. So integrate markets, we could create common political institutions, and then we would make conflicts less likely. But again, it's no one's betting on greater Europe anymore, so they're betting on greater Eurasia. So this is a new thing now. Not a new thing. It's been going on at least for the past intensified 12 years ago. This is they're reorienting the economy towards the east, and that is not just energy and regular trade, but the technological partnerships, the entire supply chains, the physical transportation corridors that Russia builds, financial cooperation in terms of banks, currencies used, payment systems across the board. The Russian economy is being reorganized to the east. This is also what made it not immune, but well, to some extent immune from all these sanctions. And indeed, the sanctions only work to intensify this shift to the east. So anyways, I think yeah, this was a miscalculation in Europe. I think when they went into this war, I think they didn't expect it to go on for this long. And as in most conflicts, yeah, yeah, the objectives shifts, and you get pulled deeper and deeper in. And now they're at the point where there's no plans anymore for how to get this old connection back. I mean, unless Russia's defeated and pays massive reparation and hands over its resources to the West. If this doesn't happen, then there's no good plan. I mean, other things could happen, of course, if you have the current governments being removed, replaced, for example, in Germany with something like AfD. And I think the Russians are pragmatic to a large extent, as you saw with the election of Trump. Suddenly, overnight, the Russians said, "Hey, maybe we can work with these Americans after all." And I think if AfD took power tomorrow, and as the leader said, she would go to Russia tried to just say, listen, went down the wrong path there. Let's try to reset relations. And on the way home, stop by Kiev and ask for the money back. I think
Yeah,
if
that's
it
gonna happen.
yeah, no, it's not going to happen. But if this was
Yeah,
the mindset that is, let's be honest about why we're in conflict. I mean, is it because the Russians are evil imperialists, or is it because after the Cold War we kind of knew that the idea of creating a Europe without Russia, that this would essentially revive or redivide the continent, revive the Cold War logic of expanding bloc politics. I think everyone in the 90s at least we could have honest discussions about this, and now we're not allowed anymore. But I think if they recognize this, that our conflicts are a symptom of the failure to establish a mutually acceptable post-Cold War security architecture, so pragmatism could come in. Okay, well, these are our security concerns, these are the Russians, how do we pursue some format of indivisible security where both sides benefit? And it's not possible these days. These days, if you even suggest it, it's somehow treated as abandoning or sacrificing Ukraine. But in reality, it's quite opposite. If you cared about the Ukrainians at all, what you want to do is remove them from these front lines of a
right.
divided Europe. We're not being pulled apart. But indivisible security would be a blessing for for Ukraine. Indeed, this was always the main argument, not just from Moscow but Kiev as well. That is, don't try to, if you only try to bring in Ukraine into Europe, if you want to call it Europe, or then you create new dividing lines between Russia and Ukraine, and this would rip the country apart from within, and also it would invite Russian intervention. So for this reason, it was always understood that, yeah, sure, we can have a European architecture that accommodates Ukraine, but then you can't keep the Russians on the outside. I mean, there's plenty of example like this. When you brought in, not you, when the EU, for example, EU brought in Croatia, it left out Bosnia. Now you have problems there.
Right.
Whenever you bring one in, you create new dividing lines. It's normal things people used to discuss. These days, it's considered appeasement or, it's yeah. So we can't discuss the most basic common sense things, but perhaps if these more ideological radical governments go away and we get some pragmatic governments again who starts with the point of departure, what's in our national interest, what serves our security, our economic interests, political stability. Usually we don't do that anymore because then the first answers would be, well, perhaps we should pick up the phone and call Moscow, especially for a country like Germany. The, the idea that whatever is in their national interest, you can have some politician or journalist say, well, that's pro-Russian. Buying gas from Russia is pro-Russian. At some point, a pragmatic government would realize you have to work with Russia to serve your own national interest. But again, they're not quite there yet.
And it was never just gas. I mean, particularly German automotive industry, they got their steel, they got their automotive parts that they manufactured in Russia brought in. That they even opened up additional manufacturing in Russia to manufacture and then bring to Germany. So yeah, they lost a huge amount of commodities and semi-finished goods. But do you think? Well, okay, we understand that NATO has to have an enemy. They try to do the war on terror, but that's not much of an enemy. Um, and then they settled back on Russia. And in 1999, I remember that because we were still preparing for war with Russia when I was in the Corps headquarters for 18th Airborne Corps. It was kind of a shock when I got there. But the European Union was first and foremost an economic project. And now, like as you said, economics doesn't seem to be at all on the dinner table. It's not even on the radar. They seem to have abandoned fully economic prosperity. Or is that just the view from this side?
No, I think they have, and this is a big problem. They now talk about the geopolitical EU, and I think this is a suicide for the EU. I think as a geoeconomic project, it could make a lot of sense because why would you make, for example, 27 member states pool their sovereignty? States tend to be, they want to maximize their sovereignty. Now, once you go into a club like the EU, well, what you do is first you surrender some of your sovereignty towards Brussels, but you have to get something in return, which makes up for that. So it's an actual advantage. And in the past, the EU could essentially say, "Listen, you join this club. We have collective bargaining power. We can set the terms of trade. We'll come 27 countries together. We'll negotiate. Let's say with Moldova, we essentially get to dictate all the terms of trade. We can protect our key industries, and we can force the opponent to open their markets completely. So we get the best trade agreements. And not only this, the EU can also put political conditionality there. So if you want to trade with us, this huge bloc, then you also have to make these political changes. And so they not just had the economic power, but they had also the tools to translate economic power into political influence. So it had, this was geoeconomic power EU, and it was quite significant. And again, it wasn't that anti-Russian in nature either, because it had a formula, if you will, how to work with Russia to a certain extent. They tried to iron out some of the differences. If you remember, in 2005,
Right.
they had the EU-Russia common spaces. They made the agreement, okay, essentially indivisible security. When we engage with a common neighborhood, let's take each other's interests into account, all of this. But now that they're a political project, that means let's seek unity against Russia. Suddenly they cut themselves off from Russian energy. They cut themselves off from the massive Russian market. And well, what happens now is essentially compelling countries to work against their own national interest, as you saw with Hungary. That was the best example. Orban wants to go to Moscow and Kiev to discuss peace. No, he's punished. You're not allowed to have your own politics. You want to buy Russian energy? No, you're not allowed. We'll take Ukraine's side if necessary to blow up these pipelines. And so suddenly it's no longer serving national interest. And then you can only hold together such a project by force. And that's what you see. You can meddle in elections in Romania, Hungary, and try to keep this together. But you have this rising opposition in even the main countries, be it Germany, France. So holding this thing together is going to, you can use some authoritarian means, but over time, it's not going to hold. It's not sustainable. So this is the problem of geopolitical Europe. In terms of NATO, I agree. I think it was after the Cold War they needed to find a way. What is a new purpose? And again, in the 90s, this was the open academic debate, not just
Right.
academic, but also the practitioners. So, what is the new purpose? And they had the slogan "out of area or out of business." So, we have to be interventionist, which
Yeah.
is a bit, and also expand. This to expanding the alliance and dropping the whole defensive alliance by going on defensive. This was the main purpose.
Hmm.
Of course, as you said, the global war on terror, you had all these different things. But
In
what the
Yugoslavia too.
Europeans thought of with the war against Russia was, well, now finally, after 3 decades, NATO has found its purpose again. That is, the Russians are back, and now we'll go back to the good old days with geostrategic clarity. That is, Europe and the US united against this, imperialist Russians. And but then they suddenly found out, oh, well, we can't go back in time because the world has shifted. It's a multipolar world. The Russia is not it's not the Soviet Union. The things we're claiming that Russia wants to do, restore the Soviet Empire, all this, it is nonsense, and the Americans knows that it's nonsense. Its main rival is China. The world is multipolar. They have to primarily, look for primacy in the Western Hemisphere and try to check China in East Asia, but Europe is not a priority. I think the Americans don't want necessarily peace, but if they can outsource the containment of Russia to gullible, submissive Europeans, then that would be a good approach, because
Yeah.
then Russia could be weakened, the Europeans would remain vulnerable and loyal and obedient. And also, if America tries to pull itself out of this, or some distance at least, then they can prevent Russia from tilting too far towards China by also having some workable relations with the US. So the Europeans find now a very different geostrategic environment in which, a Cold War with Russia, which well looks like it can get hot very soon,
Yeah, I was gonna say.
isn't gonna be this magical solution to bring together the collective West. And again, there's no political imagination for anything else, which is why the European leaders are willing to take any abuse coming out of Washington. What are they supposed to do? And in all fairness, it's a good point, because I don't see the internal cohesion in Europe. to work without the Americans. They need them as a pacifier. The European leaders, they can't govern themselves. They need the U.S. leadership. As soon as the U.S. pulls out, the Europeans will begin to yeah, have their little squabbles. So no, it is it's a difficult. There's no good solutions though. So we're entering a new time. And my argument is always for the Europeans is we should discuss this at least, the challenge. That is what does Europe do in a multipolar world? How can it how can it stick together? What is its source of power? What is its economic model? How does it stay secure? Because at the moment we're just on autopilot, which is oh, let's just try to kind of defeat the Russians and get the Americans on board, and it's a losing proposition. But yeah, there's no one's really allowed to challenge it. So here we are.
Well, the shift from a geopolitical project to a geoeconomic project to a geopolitical project. And I remember that shift because it was subtle, but it wasn't that subtle. It's like, yeah, how did you go broke? A little at a time, and then all at once, kind of like that, and all of a sudden, right, it's now strictly geopolitical. Do you think that was done on purpose, or just something that they just stumbled into over time, shifting more and more, and then falling off the cliff, or that
Well,
was
if you go back
the
20,
job to jump off that cliff?
well, if you go back 20 years, there was some reason for optimism. The early 2000s, in terms of what the geoeconomic Europe could achieve, which was
Right.
some parity with the United States, because this was still under the hegemonic moment. The US was the world hegemon, so the ambition of the Europeans was, well, the unipolar moment's great, but let's make it one of collective hegemony. The hegemon should stand on two legs, the US and the EU. And that time, there was more parity in terms of economic power. Of course, the Americans still had a technological advantage and the financial power, but nonetheless, there was some hope. And well, my argument was always that the vulnerability for the Europeans was to maintain a divided Europe, because for many Europeans they saw redividing the continent was a necessary recipe for keeping the West together. But it also has a different problem to it. That is a divided Europe, which becomes increasingly militarized. It will also be one that is more weaker and more vulnerable. So it's not going to have the same economic potential. That is, imagine if the Europe EU would try to find some common cause with Russia, or who has some higher degree of technological sovereignty, at least a more autonomous digital ecosystem. We could have done stuff together. We would also have less security problems if we could end these dividing lines. And when this is not and without the security problems, we would also be less dependent on the US, which would mean more political. And essentially, the goal for the Europeans was let's grow the economies, which
Mm-hmm.
is not now being done. And all they
The
also talked
opposite.
about European sovereignty, strategic autonomy. All this means let's be an independent actor, not just a vassal of America. Well, this isn't going to happen, is it? If you're going to go into conflict with Russia, then you're not going to be able to keep your independence because America will own you. And it was predictable that this would happen. I mean, when EU NATO expand eastwards, what happens when you reach these societies which were deeply divided, especially Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova? You're going to spark internal conflicts, and then you're going to invite the external actors, that is the NATO and Russia, to support each side. So this was always destined to happen, and it was predictable. And once that happened, it's not going to bring back the glorious Cold War, where you have a generous America, showering the Europeans with generous trade deals and free security and political unity. No, you're going to have a very different world, a world where the U.S. hegemon is gone, and they will begin to cannibalize their allies instead. And yeah, so I think we paint ourselves in a horrible corner, and yeah, there's no discussions about course correction.
Well, we saw a preview of this in Yugoslavia, the whole tragedy of Yugoslavia, and on top of that, you also had the more radical jihadist elements, which turned out to be backed somewhat by the U.S. also, um, and then you had the pro I guess the pro-West Croatian side and then the pro-East Serbian side, and you had a three-way civil war going on, and NATO intervened. I mean, we all saw what happened there. So they had a preview of that, but just nobody learned anything, or maybe that whetted their hunger.
No, I think, well, in the Yugoslav wars are remembered, I think, across Europe as, good wars, which, because, well, they buy into the moral spin of them. And I don't think, yeah, at the end of the day, Yugoslavia ended up broken up, weaker and more
Yeah,
obedient. And
mission
yeah,
accomplished.
so, sorry?
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, very much so. Well,
Sad.
it is. So, no, I think we could have had a very different Europe. And if you go back to the early 90s, there were some discussions about this. This was, especially the French were making the point that, perhaps it would be a good idea to develop a new Europe which has the Russians on the inside, because such a Europe would not have such a concentration of power in the United States. And if we don't, we would likely become vassals, and this is true. And I don't think the Europeans appreciated this by this insisting on making an enemy out of Russia again. It also made the Europeans very weak and vulnerable. But like I said, 35 years ago, we could have discussed these things openly. These days, no, it's not possible.
Yeah, it's very sad. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that is what it is. Um, and now they're talking about. I don't know if this is set in stone, but I've seen reports that the European harvest is going to be up to 40% smaller than last year's. Do you think the EU is just going to let that go and possibly have starvation in the lower classes, literal starvation, or they're going to intervene, and if they do intervene, what can they do? Particularly since Ukraine is no longer able to get any of that grain out of the Black Sea being closed.
I don't have any good answer. This is all uncharted territory. We haven't, been in this position before. That is, we have these decades of globalization, maximize efficiency, all markets tied together, and also which included outsourcing a lot of yeah, critical products, and including agricultural products. But now, yeah, well, it's again, these are the things you would assume would be discussed, but it's not. Look in the papers; it's everything is, Ukraine this, Ukraine that, Putin is evil. I mean, imagine. Well, there's no analysis of the different options that should be taken. So, for example, the decision to go and attack all these Russian ships and do this 40-day deep strikes inside Russia. Uh, you know, this is linked very much to food shortages coming up, because the Russians showed that if when they were presented with the potential of a grain deal, the Russians took it. They said, okay, well, we'll go with this predictability. And not everyone was happy with it, of course. And of course, Russia was also influenced by the global south, that they wanted yeah, agricultural exports to continue. But but when the decision was made to do this 40-day campaign, well, what did they think would happen? They knew that the Russians could retaliate. They knew that the Ukrainians were running low on air defenses. Uh, they also knew that if we attack all the Russian ships, why wouldn't they do the same? And now you have that exact thing happening in Ukraine. That is a naval blockade on Ukraine. The grains are coming out. They say trains and all this, but you can't just reroute all this agricultural export and put it on trains. It's I'm not sure people know how this works, but anyways, so you would assume that there would have been some discussions around this. Well, what might be the consequence? But it's not. It's just either you support it, or you're questioning it. But then that's for the benefit of Russia, essentially. I moved to this country after 20 years abroad, and I lived there for 6 years. I've been contacted by journalists like 20, 30 times. Not once have they actually asked about anything, any topic, any issue, any foreign policy issue that, what is the role of Europe? How can we, what do the Russians want? What are the possibilities of us? No, no. It's always ad hominem. It's always the person that is, why did you travel to Russia? Why did you publish there? Who did you speak with? Did someone pay for your plane ticket? Have you received money from Russian media? So they're out to get you because if you don't fall in line, then they're coming for you. There's no debate, there's no discussion, and it's no it. I mean, it's what can you say? There's I think a lot of these problems could have been avoided if there would have been minimal discussion. Just how did any of this serve Western interests? How did it serve Ukrainian interests? I mean, it's a lot of what's being done is very short-sighted.
Yeah, yeah. Well, last time we talked about it, we were talking about that there weren't any more Russian experts. That knowing your opponent, whether it's your enemy or a friend, was verboten. But you can do things like that. You can do it all you want, but if there's not enough food, there's just not enough food. I mean, a 40% drop in crop yields is going to skyrocket the cost of food. Never mind, there's just not going to be enough food. I mean, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, it's going to happen, but I mean, what's going to happen? How's the EU going to handle this? Because like it or not, it's coming. It's that train flying down that tunnel that everybody's in. It's not the end of the tunnel. That's the headlight on the train. What do you think their actions are going to be? Or what actions are they going to take, if any?
Well, it's hard to say. They're a regulatory power. They can make big statements, and often this is where the energy goes to come up with this common statements. But they can't. They can't print weapons. They can't, make statements to change opinions of other leaders. And they're going to discover they can't magically make food appear by signing some decree. It's so no, not sure if they have any good solutions. I don't think there's anyone really behind the wheel anymore either. So. Um, no, again, this is like as I said before, it's uncharted territory, and we don't hear much of the plans at all. Because if you bring up these questions, what you're suggesting is that some of the policies are not working. You have to change them, but you can't do that either. I mean, this is something I discovered as well because I used to for the past 12 years, like in academia, I used to focus a lot on the Greater Eurasia project, that is Russia reorienting its economy towards the east. And I was making the point when they began with these sanctions against Russia and they thought the ruble would, and the entire Russian economy would collapse before the weekend. I
Right,
was
right.
making the point that
Well, they
it's
give
not
it
going
two
to,
weeks. They give it
yeah,
2 weeks.
2 weeks, 3 weeks. But I was making the point it's not going to happen. The Russians have, made their economy largely bulletproof because they're not that dependent on the West anymore. But everyone was ideologically committed to the idea that Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. This McCain nonsense.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So, most important of all is it was immediately slandered as being pro-Russian, and it's like, well, how is it pro-Russian to argue that I make the point why the sanctions won't work? Oh well, if you say that, then it's the effect is to reduce trust in the sanctions, which means it will not have much political support. So, reality is a social construction for them. That is, if you say it doesn't work, then it won't work. So, if we all just pretend it works, then we'll commit to it and eventually it will work. This is the whole logic. So, if you make the point, yeah, if you expand NATO, you try to pull Ukraine into the orbit, you can cite any Western higher, like political leader, intelligence chiefs, whatever it will be. It doesn't matter. What you're suggesting is that we have helped to provoke this, and if we only reach out to the Russians, then perhaps we can come up with a deal. Well, that's going to undermine support for the war. And this is dependent on boycotting diplomacy and chanting that weapons are the path to peace. So you're undermining the narrative. So this is also pro-Russian, which by the way, it's never unpacked as a concept. We
Yeah.
all have to hate Russia here. So no, it's there's no debate anymore. It's just its narratives, and it's they're protected to a very high degree. So
This sounds so much, particularly like the early Soviet Union, where everybody was afraid to say anything against the policy, no matter how idiotic the policy was. It just sounds so much like that. It's ludicrous. But I guess societies kind of repeat their own mistakes or repeat the mistakes of their neighbors. They go through the same phases.
yeah, well, and we were supposed to avoid that though, because we were supposed to be, liberal democracy, so you're supposed to be allowed to speak out. But something interesting happened. That is, liberalism kind of turned on itself. That is, because within liberalism there's a contradiction. On one hand, you're supposed to be able to, everyone has their own path to or vision of the good life. You're supposed to be able to challenge everything. On the other side, you assume that there's one answer to progress. So you come up with all these liberal principles, and you can't challenge them. So especially from the 90s, it came the idea that, oh, well, my migration is good for society. This is the liberal thing. We can't get stuck in, nationalism. And then it was agreed. And anyone who went opposed to mass migration, that meant you're a racist. So suddenly you shut down all discussion because it was a liberal principle and you're not allowed to challenge it. And you had the same with all this everything from, gay marriage and all the LGBT stuff that I see. Well, if you want marriage to be, as an institution, you believe it should be best preserved by maintaining it as a, the family unit that is a man and a woman. Well, then you hate gays. Okay, so now you're not allowed to say this So only a few years ago, if you remember Clinton and Obama, they all said that, a marriage should be between a man and woman. You're not allowed
Yep.
to say that because then you hate the gays, they say. So, and you're a bigot. So suddenly you criminalized opposition there as well. And you do the same also with wars. That is because whatever war we go into, it's always humanitarian. We in Yugoslavia, we really cared about well, there was many wars, but for the and the last one, 99, we really cared about human rights of Albanians. In Syria, oh, it was Assad killing his own people. The same script in Libya. It's always this Iran, oh, we just want to liberate little girls. It's always this kind of um, it is human rights way of selling wars, which means that if you oppose it, you just don't care. So because only if you really care, you would want to bomb them, But if you care about the Iranians, you wouldn't oppose bombing. If you cared about the Libyans, you wouldn't oppose bombing, And this is always the logic. So you use liberal principles to essentially shut down any debate, and it's the same now with this proxy war on Russia. It's It's well, if you want to negotiate with the Russians, well, then you don't care about the Ukrainians. Well, we know that what's going to happen if this war continues. The Ukrainian nation itself might be destroyed, but you know you're still anti-Ukrainian if you if you think that we should sit down with the Russians. It doesn't have to make any sense. You just create this position where you criminalize all opposition.
Right before the Iran war kicked off, I was on a video debate with a guy. I don't remember his name, Scott something or other. He was described to me as a George Bush Republican. He's like, yes, we're going to go into Iran and we're going to liberate the women. I'm like, well, first of all, did you even ask the women if they wanted to be liberated? And how are you get? Who gives you the right to go quote liberate somebody in some other society? Well, that's our duty is to go liberate them by bombing them. And he didn't have much anything to say to that. He was on that platform. We're liberating them. Never mind that we have to kill half of them to liberate them and burn their societies down. But you're right, and it's just the moment you challenge them, they don't have any depth for their arguments. It's just take it. It's faith. It's a
Yeah.
radical religion.
No, no. Again, yeah, they don't unpack these things. It's this slogans which sounds nice, but this is often what one also does when you build a case for war. You come first up with a concept which everyone would agree with, but it's like an empty vessel. You can fill it with whatever you want. So well, we always, this is what we essentially heard, not just since 2014, but beyond that is, oh, we have to support Ukrainians' right to choose their own future. Okay, well, that sounds like a lovely concept. Let's, everyone can get on board. But what do you put into this? Well, that was used for a reason why Yanukovych had to be toppled. He was democratically elected. We know that the majority of Ukrainians didn't support the toppling of Yanukovych. The majority didn't support Maidan. The majority, um, you know, the, there's no support for this. Also, that since 91 to at least 2014, it was about 20% of Ukrainians, sometimes went up to 24% of Ukrainians who even wanted NATO membership. But
Yep. Yeah.
this was also necessary to stand with Ukraine to let them choose themselves. In 2019, they elected, Zelensky on this peace platform where they're going to make peace with Donbass, Russia, implement the Minsk agreement. Well, this is capitulation. We have to help Ukraine stand up to this Russian pressure. So now, helping them entails ignoring what 73% voted for.
Yep.
So you come with a concept everyone can get on board with. Let's be tolerant, and then okay, well then we can't have borders anymore. Okay, let's help Ukrainians because they're suffering. Okay, wonderful, sign me up. Okay, well then we just have to dismantle their democracy, arm some right-wing extremists, and send them into war. And then once they're in war, boycott all diplomacy, chant that weapons are the path to peace, and sit on the sideline and watch these people get massacred. I mean, it's wild, but people speak in slogans, and the slogans, they build up this initial consensus, and then people stick to it.
Yep. You are absolutely right. It's a sad state of affairs, but that's where we're at. Um, Glenn, I want to thank you for joining the program. You're always a great guest. Um, Unfortunately, we never have these happy topics.
No, I was
Not
gonna
even
say.
a little one. Just every one of I don't think anybody even asked anyone, why do you guys laugh? Because you either laugh or you cry. I think everybody's really figured that out. It's either cry in a corner or kind of do the gallows humor laugh. Um,
There's research into this actually. They found out in Bosnia as well that when a country has gone when this times looks dark, they often develop dark humor as a way of coping. So, and these are dark times indeed,
yeah.
So yeah, we can't just curl up in a ball and cry all day, I guess.
Well, so some people would love us to do that. That's what antidepressants are for. You make a lot. um, on that topic, I don't know if it's true or not, but I was reading that Americans make up 70% of the world's usage of antidepressants, which is, if you think about it, is really, really insane. But yeah, I guess a lot of people curl up in the ball and cry, and that's one way. Laughing is better, no matter how dark the humor is.
Yeah. Now the pharmaceutical industry in the US needs to be put under control, but there's no money in that, so I don't expect it to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, like a lot of things, unfortunately. You've got the arms industry is gone insane, and you need the pharmaceuticals. Which, by the way, the pharmaceutical industry made a lot of money off of this Ukrainian war, drugging up Ukrainian soldiers, combat drugs. So, on that note, and that's going to flow, if it hasn't already flown back, that's going to flow back into Europe too, in the narcotics industry. It's just insane quantities that were just given out, shipped in. Especially, it's starting in 2014, but I mean, it really took off in 22. So there's that to deal with too. So
Yeah, so yeah, which underscores the point. There's not a lot of positive things happening these days. So, but yeah, it's I'm starting to think this war can't go on forever now, though. Because it's intensifying in such a massive way. Either I think it's going to blow up to a direct war between NATO and Russia, or it's going to have to collapse because I don't know. I watched daily how the Russian strikes on Odessa, Kiev are intensifying, the destruction of all this logistics, its supplies, and it can't continue in this pace anymore. So this is either the time for escalate or or capitulate. So I think
Yeah.
it's not going to be capitulation, but this stage of the war, it can't go on for that much longer, I think.
True. Very true. Um, well, we'll see what happens, and we can discuss it in a week or two, and then hopefully, maybe always end on a bright side. Maybe we'll have some good news.
Yeah, no, I would welcome that.
Yeah,
Maybe then we can finish on a positive note.
just once.
Yeah,
Glenn, thank you very much one more time, and if you can make the youth conference and everything, glad to see you there too.
great. No, I'll look into it.
Yep. Cheers, everybody. Thank you.